Hello and welcome back to my studio, and welcome to the next in my series of quick watercolour tips. This is tip number 7, and I'll be giving you a few tips on how to use salt for special effects in your watercolour painting. So what happens when you sprinkle ordinary table salt, either fine or larger crystals, it doesn't really matter, it's down to personal preference and exploration, into your watercolour paint? Well, sprinkled into the damp paint, each grain of salt sort of pushes away the water in the paint. And depending on how much water is there will depend on the size of mark. If you look at some of these photographs that I'm showing you here of paintings, the foreground patterns have been created using this technique. And here I can give you the first tip, which is the most general rule, is that the salt effects will only work in this way and give you these tiny little blossoms where each grain has pushed the salt out in the shape of like a flower or a frost pattern or whatever you want to call it, is that you sprinkle the salt onto fairly rich paint, but the paint has to be only just damp. If it's too wet, the salt will dissolve while it's pushing the paint out and just give you a very blurry, sort of muddy effect. If it's too dry, there'll be no reaction. So the tip I'm going to give you is a way to test out the way salt will work in your studio and the individual sort of climate that you have there, how hot or how cold it is in your studio, how humid it is, and other factors that will influence the way the salt behaves is the kind of paper that you use, the type of paints, the colours that you use. I've heard that some colours are less effective than others for this sort of salt effect, but I haven't found that myself. I think the important thing here is to make sure you can get the timing of the paper right and the timing of how damp the paper is. If it's too wet, don't be tempted to sprinkle the salt in because it will dissolve and create a mess, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that here. I'm using the back of an old painting. I'm going to wet the page and then I'm going to use really rich paint, any old colours, it's whatever I've got left on my palette. And I'm just going to dash the paint across the page, and then I'm going to spray it with water to make sure it's extra wet in certain places. And then I'll sprinkle the salt into it, and I'll do a time-lapse test. And hopefully we should be able to see the salt working where the paint is only damp, and overworking and dissolving where the paper is too wet. So I think I've just got indigo, sepia, raw sienna and burnt sienna. I don't really mind, not trying to paint anything here, just nice rich paint. My board's at an angle of about 20 degrees, so I'm just spraying it now with the water spray, and that will just wet it in places. And then I'm just going to tip the water, tip the paper so that the water sort of runs around on the page, so that I've got some areas that are really wet and others that are probably already starting to dry. But as I say, it will depend on the unique conditions in your studio, how the salt reacts. And so finding out with an experiment like this is the best way for you to learn how to use the salt to create the effects that you want to create. So I'm just spreading the paint around, sort of thinning it out in places, and all the time I'm looking at how much water there is. And hopefully you saw where it's caught the light, that the page is very wet in the middle and over on the left-hand side. But top and bottom right corners, I can see that the paint is beginning to dry. I know that because I can see that the sheen is far less in those areas. So I'm confident when I sprinkle my finely ground table salt across the whole page that top and bottom right corners are going to give me the best results. So it's ordinary table salt. Mine is fine ground. You can experiment with any size grind that you like, just sprinkling it across. And then I shall condense about 25 minutes, half an hour drying time into a minute time lapse, so that you can enjoy watching paint dry. And here's the time lapse, and you can already see that in the middle and over towards the left it's much lighter because the salt has dissolved, it's really spread out, it's gone quite muddy and it's lost any definition. But I hope you can also see that towards the right, where the paint is still a bit stronger, the page was drier, the paint was drier, so the salt effects are beginning to make those little tiny blossom or frost pattern shapes. It's almost dry. I'd say it's half dry actually, so I'll just show you the progress. Really muddy. Paint was too thick there, but if we move over there to the bottom, you can see there's our little salt blossoms, which is what we're looking for, where the paint was damp, the sheen was just going off it. And here, where it's slightly wetter, we have a slightly wilder effect. And then towards the top, again, we get those little tiny frost patterns or little flower blossoms, as I call them. There's a lot of granulation that's happened, but there's a lot of mud too. I love nearly all of the textures and the granulation that's happened here. And I think it's an interesting experimental piece. Now, I've finished off the drying off camera, and here's the dried experiment, and we'll take a closer look in a moment, but sometimes you'll get some salt sort of left on the page where it hasn't completely dissolved, so the best thing to do is get a clean dry brush and just brush off any surplus remaining salt. So let's remove the tape and have a look at the experiment with a clean border, and it always helps us to see things more clearly when we don't see the brush strokes that go across the tape. Now, those of you that love abstracts, I'm sure will love lots of these effects here. But if you're looking for the more realistic effects, then studying your experiment like this, making some notes as well of your findings, will really help you then to be able to work a little bit more predictably with salt in your landscape paintings. If we just zoom in a bit, you can see here where it is a bit of a muddy mess, but the textures are still really nice, but it's not exactly what I was looking for. This area here is a lot better. We have our beautiful little individual frost patterns. If you could imagine those in a foreground painting as sort of frosty seed heads and flowers or brambles in a winter painting, I think that, you know, those effects are lovely. But here, where the salt has gone onto the wet page, it's all a bit nothing. It's all a bit muddy and a bit messy. And I think you'd find that would spoil your painting if you ended up with a foreground that looked like that. So try out these experiments for yourself. Make notes in your sketchbook so that you understand the timing of your paper, the timing of your water and your paint. And I'm sure that you'll have some really successful results with your salt. And patience is probably key with this. I would err on the paper being sort of too dry than it being too wet before you apply the salt. If it's too dry, you won't get any effects, but then you won't spoil your paint application either. But you'll find with practice that you'll find that really sweet spot just before it dries, so that when you sprinkle on your salt crystals, you'll get these delicate frost patterns and flowers on a regular basis. So I hope that was helpful. If you want to see more quick watercolour tips, please check out the playlist. And if you liked the video, then please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. It's free to do, and if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified whenever we post a new video. And thank you so much to everybody that supports this channel on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. And if you would like to support the channel on Patreon, then please follow the links below. I'm off out for a nice winter walk now, maybe do some sketching, take some photographs as inspiration. So I'll see you again soon.